The Thursday evening Bible study at Grace Chapel was a small, devoted gathering. They met like clockwork each week, some for a sense of community, others to find solace from life's hardships. It was here, amid hushed discussions of faith and forgiveness, that the delicate veil of one family's secrets began to unravel. Elizabeth Parker was a woman known for her steadfastness and grace. She was an anchor in the group, offering compassionate guidance, and as the wife of Evan Parker, she was the picture of a devout, supportive spouse. But for weeks, an unsettling feeling had plagued her. Evan, normally warm and open, had grown distant, guarded. His phone, which he used to leave on the kitchen counter without a second thought, was now constantly with him, tucked away and silent. And then there was her younger sister, Amanda. Recently divorced, Amanda had been leaning on Elizabeth and her family for support, spending increasing time with them. Too much time, perhaps. Elizabeth's suspicions weren't born from jealousy or mistrust, but rather from an intuition that came from years of knowing both her husband and her sister intimately. Little things, a glance that lingered, a stammered excuse, a shared laugh that felt too intimate, became harder to ignore. But Elizabeth kept silent, her smile and her eyes as steady as ever, waiting for the right moment. That moment arrived in the most unexpected of places. On that Thursday evening, the Bible study was centered on the topic of temptation and fidelity. As the group read a passage from Proverbs about the perils of straying hearts, Elizabeth decided the time had come. Her voice, calm and steady, sliced through the quiet reverence of the room. "Evan, I have a question for you." She held her husband's gaze, her eyes unwavering. The others around the room grew silent, sensing the tension thickening in the air. "What do you believe the consequences of betrayal are?" she asked, her words a double-edged sword. Evan's face blanched. He stammered, casting a glance around the room. Amanda, seated across from him, fidgeted nervously, her fingers twisting the edge of her sweater. It was then that Elizabeth's gaze shifted, a knowing look that fell directly upon her sister. A pin-drop silence engulfed the group, every eye bouncing between Elizabeth, Evan, and Amanda. "Amanda!" Elizabeth's voice was unwavering. "What do you think about betrayal?" Amanda's face turned crimson, and she glanced down, clearly unwilling to meet her sister's gaze. Someone in the group cleared their throat awkwardly, but Elizabeth continued. "Week after week, we come here to discuss faith, integrity, and honesty. But can we really claim to understand those values if we're unwilling to face the truth about our own lives?" The group looked on, a sense of realization dawning as Elizabeth's pointed words cut deeper. Evan's discomfort was undeniable. Amanda looked ready to flee. The tension was electric, thick with accusation and undeniable guilt. And then, finally, Amanda spoke. "Liz, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. With that single admission, the room descended into stunned silence. Evan's face, pale and strained, reflected the weight of his shame. But Elizabeth didn't flinch. She stood as she always had, a tower of quiet strength. The fallout was swift and brutal. The Bible study group, once a safe haven, was now a stage for scandal and heartbreak. Elizabeth's quiet dignity in the face of betrayal left everyone speechless. And though she later shed private tears, in that moment, she exuded a strength that not even betrayal could destroy. After that night, Elizabeth didn't return to Grace Chapel. The Bible study group dispersed, whispers of that night following its former members in hushed conversations for months to come. For the rest of the town, the scandal became a cautionary tale, a story of betrayal that stained even the hallowed grounds of faith and fellowship. Elizabeth, meanwhile, would go on to rebuild her life, her composure intact, but her heart forever changed. And as for Evan and Amanda, their guilt-bound affair dissolved as swiftly as it had begun, leaving them to wrestle with the consequences of their choices, haunted by the strength and resolve of the woman they had so carelessly wronged. The aftermath of that Thursday night spread through the town like wildfire. Elizabeth's quiet confrontation became the talk of coffee shops, whispered in aisles of the grocery store, and mulled over at dinners. Everyone seemed to have an opinion, but no one was brave enough to voice it to her face. Elizabeth knew she was the subject of rumor, but she held her head high, determined not to let gossip diminish her dignity. A week after the Bible study, Evan approached her. He had stayed at a motel since that night, desperately trying to salvage his unraveling life. But his calls went unanswered, and his texts remained unread. When he finally arrived on her doorstep, he was a man humbled and broken. He stood there in silence for a long moment, his hand poised to knock. But Elizabeth didn't wait for him to find the courage. She opened the door herself. "Evan," she said, her voice steady but cold. "Elizabeth," he replied, his tone pleading. I need to explain." Elizabeth regarded him for a moment, as though seeing him anew. This man, who had once been her partner, her confidant, now seemed like a stranger. She gestured for him to enter, leading him into the living room. The home they'd built together felt hollow in the silence that followed. "You want to explain?" Elizabeth said, her voice even. "Go ahead." Evan struggled for words, glancing around the room as if searching for an anchor. "I don't know where to begin. It was a mistake, Elizabeth. A terrible, terrible mistake. I don't even know how it happened." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow. "You don't know how it happened?" she repeated, her tone laced with disbelief. "Isn't that convenient?" He flinched, running a hand through his hair. "It's not like that. Amanda, she was struggling. I thought I was helping her. We just got too close." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "And was it worth it?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried a weight that bore down on him. "Was it worth betraying the trust of two people who loved you?" Evan's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked truly defeated. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I would give anything to take it back." Elizabeth studied him for a long moment, a complex mixture of sorrow and pity in her gaze. "You know, Evan," she began, her voice softened, "forgiveness is a cornerstone of faith. I've spent years trying to live by that principle." She took a steadying breath, her eyes never leaving his. "But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And it certainly isn't the same as staying." A look of desperation crossed Evan's face. "Elizabeth, please. We can work through this. I'll do whatever it takes." Her gaze remained unyielding. "This isn't something you can fix with apologies, Evan. You've broken something fundamental, something I trusted you to keep safe. How can I ever believe in us again when you've shattered the foundation?" Evan's face crumpled, and he sank into the chair opposite her. He could feel the walls closing in, the realization that he had lost something precious, irretrievable, sinking deeper with each passing second. After a long silence, Elizabeth stood up. "I need you to leave," she said, her tone final. "Maybe one day I'll be able to forgive you. But right now, I need to heal. And I can't do that with you here." Evan looked as though he wanted to argue, to beg, but something in her eyes told him it would be pointless. He rose slowly, casting one last pleading glance at her. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth," he murmured, before turning and walking out. the weight of his actions finally settling upon him. As the door closed behind him, Elizabeth allowed herself a single tear. She didn't regret her decision. It was necessary, though it tore at her heart. She knew that healing would be a long and difficult road, but she also knew she had the strength to walk it. In the weeks that followed, Elizabeth found herself transforming. Her pain, once sharp and bitter, softened, became a quiet resolve. She threw herself into her work, her friendships, and slowly, new interests that brought her moments of peace. She found solace in the routines of her life and in the support of friends who rallied around her, helping her rediscover the parts of herself she had set aside for others. As for Evan, his life fell into a fractured state. The affair had been the first crack, but without Elizabeth, his world seemed to crumble. Rumors about Amanda and Evan floated around town, a stain that neither could shake. Amanda eventually moved away, unable to face the stares and whispers that followed her. Months later, Elizabeth returned to Grace Chapel, not as a broken woman, but as one who had pieced herself back together. Her presence, still graceful, yet fortified by new strength, commanded respect. She no longer sought solace in others' approval, but found it within herself. And so, the story of Elizabeth, Evan, and Amanda became legend in the small town, a story of betrayal, resilience, and redemption. For Elizabeth, it was a journey toward reclaiming herself, a journey that taught her the hardest lesson of all, that some relationships were meant to be left behind, so that she could finally walk forward on her own. As Elizabeth slowly rebuilt her life, a newfound confidence and clarity settled within her. She returned to the Bible study one evening, her presence unexpected but welcome, as those who had once witnessed her heartbreak looked on with surprise and admiration. Elizabeth was not the same woman they had known. She had transformed. During the session, the group discussed forgiveness and accountability, two concepts now deeply personal to Elizabeth. When it was her turn to speak, she shared her thoughts with a calm conviction. Forgiveness isn't about letting others off the hook for their actions, she began, her voice steady. It's about freeing ourselves from the bitterness that keeps us trapped in the past. Her words resonated, a revelation wrapped in the pain she had endured. But forgiveness doesn't mean we owe anyone our loyalty after they've betrayed our trust. I'm learning that true peace comes when we let go of anger, of regret, of people who aren't worthy of the love we give. A respectful silence followed her words, as each person absorbed the wisdom she'd earned through hard experience. She had forgiven, yes, but she hadn't forgotten, and she hadn't allowed herself to fall back into the trap of false reconciliation. One evening after the study, a man named David, who had joined the group only recently, approached her. David was quiet and unassuming, a widower who carried his own scars. He admired Elizabeth's strength, the grace with which she had weathered betrayal. Over coffee they found an easy rapport, an understanding born of shared hardship. Their conversations grew over the following weeks. David listened with patience, his respect for Elizabeth's boundaries unwavering, never pressing her to share more than she was ready to reveal. Elizabeth felt a cautious hope stir within her, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She was careful, mindful of the trust she had once given so freely, and yet David's quiet strength and kindness began to feel like a balm to her heart. One evening as they walked along the winding path outside the chapel, David paused, looking out at the horizon with an introspective gaze. "You know, I never thought I'd feel hope again. Not after everything," he said softly. He glanced at Elizabeth, his eyes kind. "But meeting you has reminded me that it's possible to start fresh, even after all we've been through. Elizabeth met his gaze, feeling a warmth that had eluded her for so long. "I thought the same," she admitted, her voice tinged with a vulnerability she rarely showed. "I thought I was destined to carry that pain forever." David offered a gentle smile. "Maybe we don't have to carry it alone." As they stood there, an understanding passed between them, unspoken but deeply felt. They both knew that healing was not a destination, but a journey, one that took courage, patience, and time. And for the first time since that fateful night, Elizabeth felt a spark of genuine happiness, a flicker of hope that perhaps this next chapter of her life might bring more than just healing. It might bring joy. In the months that followed, Elizabeth and David continued to build a quiet, steady companionship. They moved slowly, savoring each moment, each conversation, as two people who knew the value of patience and trust. And though the scars of her past would never fully fade, Elizabeth found herself grateful for the strength it had given her, the strength to leave behind what had broken her and to embrace a future that was hers to create. By the time a year had passed, the townsfolk had long forgotten the scandal of Elizabeth, Evan, and Amanda. Instead, they spoke in whispers of admiration about the woman who had turned her heartbreak into resilience, a story of quiet, graceful strength that inspired many in their small town. And Elizabeth, walking alongside David through a life she had reclaimed as her own, finally felt the peace she had so fiercely fought for. She had learned to forgive, to let go, and ultimately to open her heart once more, not just to someone new, but to the possibility of love without compromise, loyalty without betrayal, and joy that was entirely her own. As time wore on, Elizabeth and David's companionship blossomed into a love neither had anticipated, but both cherished deeply. Their bond was one built on mutual respect and the silent understanding of two souls who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. Slowly, their relationship became a quiet fixture in the town, inspiring whispers not of scandal, but of admiration and respect for the woman who had risen from heartbreak to find peace. Months turned into a year, and Elizabeth found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her here. There were still moments when she felt a pang of sadness, shadows of her past that flickered in moments of quiet. But those shadows no longer had power over her. They had been replaced by a sense of gratitude for the strength she'd found within herself, and for the people who had supported her through her pain, and most of all, for David. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves outside swirled in shades of amber and crimson, David took Elizabeth to a quiet corner of her favorite park. Under the shelter of a large oak tree, he took her hands in his gaze steady and full of warmth. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Meeting you was like finding a light I didn't realize I needed. You've shown me what it means to heal, to trust, and to love without fear. I don't want to walk through this life with anyone else." Her heart fluttered, a feeling of joy spreading through her as she looked into his eyes, seeing a love she knew was true. Without a word, she nodded, a tear escaping as she smiled. In that moment, she realized that life had not only granted her healing, but also a second chance at happiness. A small, intimate wedding was planned in the chapel, surrounded by a few close friends who had supported them both. Elizabeth walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, her steps steady and sure. A woman who had fought her way through pain and emerged whole. David waited for her, his expression one of pure adoration, as they exchanged vows filled with the weight of all they'd overcome. The town rejoiced in their happiness, touched by the story of resilience and redemption that had unfolded before them. Elizabeth's strength had become a source of inspiration, her quiet dignity a reminder of the power in forgiveness and the courage to start anew. Years later, Elizabeth would often return to that old Bible study, no longer as a broken-hearted woman, but as one who had found her way back to joy. She shared her story with others, her words now an offering of hope, and when she walked home, hand in hand with David, she knew that while life had given her scars, it had also given her the chance to rebuild, to love, and to live fully once more. In the end, Elizabeth's life was a testament to resilience, a quiet but powerful reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal, and that sometimes the greatest love stories were born not from perfection, but from the courage to rise from the ashes of a broken heart.